They put the cuffs on him, a serving royal guard in full ceremonial uniform, dragged from his post in front of hundreds of stunned tourists. You might think he shouted, fought, or tried to break free. He didn't. He stood completely still. So why didn't he resist? And why did a Household Cavalry colonel arrive minutes later and declare, in front of the entire courtyard, that this would not be forgotten? What happened next would flip centuries of quiet discipline into a public stand no one expected. Now, before we reveal the full story, first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The air over Whitehall that afternoon was the kind of cold that seeps through every layer, no matter how many you wear. It had snowed lightly at dawn, just enough to leave a dusting across the slate roofs and cobblestones, and now the low winter sun was throwing sharp, silver light through the gaps in the buildings. Each breath came out in small clouds, the air clean and biting. Staff Sergeant William Harrow stood at his post beneath the stone arch of Horse Guards Parade, the tall black bearskin hat casting a shadow down across his eyes. At 46, he carried himself with the kind of composure that only comes from decades of service, first in Iraq, then Afghanistan, and now here on the historic ceremonial ground. The scarlet wool of his tunic seemed almost to glow against the pale light, each brass button polished to the kind of shine that reflected the sky. His boots were planted square on the gravel, heels perfectly aligned, rifle at his side. From a distance, he looked like a figure carved in stone, a man frozen in place. But behind that stillness was a sharp, constant awareness. Harrow never stopped reading the space around him. The sound of boots approaching, the rhythm of traffic on Whitehall, the weight of eyes on his back. Every guard learns it. You become part of the scenery for the public, but you are never truly off watch. Tourists came and went in small groups, their chatter carried on the wind. A family in thick parkas posed for photographs near the arch. A couple leaned against the railing, their breath mingling in the cold air as they studied a map. Every so often a phone camera clicked, the sound swallowed by the open courtyard. What the visitors didn't see was the heightened presence of Metropolitan Police along the street. Small knots of uniformed officers, vans parked in side roads, plainclothes operatives stationed in the flow of pedestrian traffic. Harrow had been briefed that morning. A foreign trade delegation was in the area, and protocol meant extra eyes and tighter perimeters. Nothing unusual for London, but still you paid attention. A shift of movement caught his peripheral vision, two men lingering longer than tourists usually do. No cameras, no idle wandering. They stood just off to his left, hands in heavy coats, speaking into earpieces with the clipped, rhythmic tone of people used to giving updates. One of them glanced at Harrow more than once, not the quick glance of a curious passerby, but a longer, measuring look, the kind you remember. The cold wind stirred, lifting the edge of Harrow's white leather strap. He ignored it, ignored them too. Still, somewhere under the discipline, he filed the sight away. Because out here, you learned fast. Trouble rarely announced itself loudly at first. It usually started as a shadow in the corner of your vision and stayed there until it stepped closer. The two men didn't drift away like most loiterers did. They stayed, shifting their weight, murmuring into their earpieces, their eyes coming back to Harrow again and again. Both were in their 30s, fit in that gym-trained way, clean-shaven and wearing the kind of dark coats that blended into a London crowd. They weren't police. Harrow could tell that in seconds, and if they were military, they weren't British. One of them, taller with a close-cropped fade, finally stepped closer, boots crunching on the gravel until he was just inside the invisible boundary every guard carried in his head. He looked Harrow up and down, a smirk tugging at one corner of his mouth. "Statue duty, huh?" he said, voice low but just loud enough to carry to a nearby group of tourists. "Bet you've been out here so long you've frozen solid." No response. Harrow's eyes stayed locked on the middle distance, just as they had for the past 40 minutes. The man chuckled, glancing back at his partner. "You hear that, Mike? Not a word. Must be trained to ignore everything. Wonder how he'd handle a real situation." Mike didn't smile. He just studied Harrow like a man assessing a problem to solve. "Don't push it," he muttered. But the taller man ignored him. A cluster of tourists had started paying attention now, phones raised, half expecting a reaction. Harrow remained motionless, shifting only the smallest fraction to block the man from stepping deeper into the ceremonial space. The smirk deepened. What happens if I just walk through here? You gonna stop me? Or just keep staring into the middle distance like a mannequin? From behind the rope line, a boy of about 8 tugged on his father's sleeve. Dad, why is he bothering the Queen's soldier? The father hushed him quickly. Just watch, son. The man in front of Harrow took a deliberate step closer, his boots now squarely on the ceremonial gravel that no tourist was allowed to cross. Harrow didn't move, but his posture seemed to sharpen. A fraction straighter, chin tilted a hair higher. It was the kind of shift you only noticed if you knew what to look for. Mike spoke again, quieter this time, into his earpiece. Harrow caught only fragments. Confirm, stand by, clearance. And then the taller man leaned in just slightly. Don't worry, Sergeant. Won't take long. And for the first time, Harrow felt the faint hum of trouble settling in the air, the kind of tension that made the cold feel sharper, the space around you smaller. Mike's voice in the earpiece must have brought a response because the taller man straightened slightly, eyes flicking toward Whitehall. A police van had rolled up to the far end of the street. 2 uniformed Metropolitan officers stepping out with the purposeful stride of people responding to a call. They weren't running, but they weren't strolling either. Harrow's focus didn't shift, but he caught their reflection in the glass of a nearby door. One officer, a young constable still carrying the tension of inexperience, the other older, face set in that weary expression of someone used to getting through their shift without making waves. The taller man reached into his coat pocket and produced a black leather badge wallet, flipping it open just long enough for the nearest tourist to see something that looked official. Security clearance, he announced, for the benefit of the phones now recording. We're conducting an authorized sweep of this post. Harrow's voice, when it came, was low and controlled. You have no authority to remove me from ceremonial duty without my commanding officer present. The man's smirk didn't fade. Orders are orders, Sergeant. Now step aside. Not from you, Harrow replied, eyes still fixed forward. The officers arrived then, boots crunching on the gravel. The younger one glanced between the contractors and Harrow, clearly uncertain. The older officer addressed the taller man. This the guard? That's him, the contractor said smoothly. Obstructing a sweep. Orders to detain pending verification. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. Is this military jurisdiction? The taller man didn't miss a beat. We've got clearance from the delegation's security liaison. Faster to pull him now and sort the paperwork later. Harrow finally moved, just enough to turn his head slightly toward the officers. Constable, you'll want to confirm that with Colonel Lennox before you lay a hand on me. The older officer hesitated, but the younger one glanced at the badge in the contractor's hand and nodded slightly. We should just... And then came the sound Harrow had been waiting for but hoping not to hear. The metallic double click of handcuffs. The older officer stepped forward, gently but firmly, taking Harrow's left wrist. Sorry, mate, just until we clear this up. Phones went higher into the air. Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Disbelief, indignation, the occasional shout of, "You can't do that!" from the rope line. The boy from earlier had gone wide-eyed, his father putting a hand on his shoulder. Harrow didn't resist. His jaw tightened, breath steady, eyes still forward. But every movement around him was now being etched into memory, because this wasn't procedure. This was something else. The cuffs locked with a sharp snap, the cold metal biting through his gloves. And just like that, the stillness of ceremony was broken. The sight of a royal guard in full dress being cuffed was so jarring that even the cold seemed to pause. Phones were raised like a forest of antennae. Some tourists were narrating under their breath for live streams. Others simply stood with mouths open. Across the rope line, people whispered to each other in half sentences. Can they do that? Isn't he military? Kupki, surely not on duty. The younger officer began to steer Harrow toward the open side door of the police van, careful not to jostle his rifle. The taller contractor followed a half-step behind, a faint smirk on his face, as if the matter were already closed. From the far end of the cordon came the sudden growl of a diesel engine. A black SUV with military plates swung off Whitehall, crossing into the restricted area without slowing. Its brakes hissed to a stop on the cobbles, and in the same motion the rear door opened. Colonel James Lennox stepped out. He wasn't in ceremonial dress, just the dark overcoat of the Household Cavalry over a service uniform, peaked cap low over sharp eyes. But the way he moved made the space around him feel smaller. Even before he spoke, people knew exactly who had just arrived. He cut straight across the gravel, boots crunching with a deliberate pace. The officers turned at the sound, their hold on Harrow loosening without conscious thought. The contractors exchanged quick, uncertain glances. "Who gave this order?" Lennox's voice wasn't raised, but it carried. He didn't stop walking until he was a yard from the older officer. "Sir, the officer began. Lennox didn't look at him, his eyes fixed on the taller contractor. "I asked, under whose authority?" The smirk faltered. "We're with the security detail for—" "I didn't ask who you're with. I asked under whose authority you've placed your hands on my guard." The pause that followed was long enough for the cold wind to whistle faintly between the buildings. The younger officer cleared his throat. "We were told there was—" "Constable, if someone told you to arrest the king himself, would you do it without verifying?" Lennox didn't blink. "You've just removed a serving soldier from post without authorization from the palace, the Ministry of Defence, or me. That's unlawful." The older officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we can release— You'll do more than that." Lennox stepped forward and with a single practiced motion unlocked the cuffs himself. The metallic snap rang out over the gravel. Harrow flexed his wrists once, then returned his rifle to his side, posture perfect. Lennox turned back to the contractors, his voice still level but carrying the weight of steel. "You're going to remain right here until the palace liaison arrives. Then you'll explain exactly why you thought you could override centuries of tradition and the chain of command in this courtyard." Phones were still recording, the crowd now utterly silent. Even the horses in the stables beyond the arch seemed to have gone still. Harrow didn't move, except to adjust his footing back into the stance he'd held before, but the change was unmistakable. The guard was back on post, and the balance of the space had shifted. Colonel Lennox didn't turn away from the contractors immediately. He let the silence stretch, his gaze steady, until the taller man looked down at the gravel. Only then did Lennox speak, not in a shout, not in a barked order, but in the calm, deliberate cadence of someone who knew his words would land harder without force. "You have just placed your hands on a serving soldier during the execution of ceremonial duty. That's not a misunderstanding, that's an offence, and it will be answered for." A ripple went through the onlookers. The crowd was no longer restless. They were stock still, leaning in, sensing that something important was being laid down in front of them. The older police constable cleared his throat. "Sir, in fairness, we acted on—" "You acted on information from civilians with no legal authority here," Lennox interrupted, still without raising his voice. "And in doing so, you compromised the integrity of this post and the safety of this guard. That is the reality." The contractors tried again, this time leaning on jargon. "Delegation security protocol, risk perimeter, standard sweep procedures." But Lennox cut through it with a slight lift of his hand. "I know every security protocol in this city," he said evenly. "Not one of them permits you to override the chain of command on the forecourt of horse guards, and certainly not to humiliate a soldier in front of the public for the sake of your own timetable." He turned his head toward the tourists, his voice carrying just enough for them to hear without it sounding like a performance. "This guard's post is protected by law and by a tradition older than most of the buildings you can see from here. It is not theatre. It is not an ornament for visitors. It is a living reminder of service. and it will be treated as such. A woman near the rope line murmured to her companion, "Good for him," and a few heads nodded. Lennox faced the officers again. "You'll stand down now. You'll await the palace liaison, and you'll ensure no further interference with this post." The older constable nodded immediately. The younger one looked as though he wanted to apologize, but kept silent, hands clasped behind his back. Then Lennox turned to Harrow. "Resume your position." Harrow stepped back onto his exact mark, rifle angled correctly, eyes fixed forward as if nothing had happened. But there was a subtle difference in the air. The crowd no longer saw just a soldier standing still. They saw the man the colonel had crossed the courtyard to defend. Lennox remained a few moments longer, hands clasped behind his back, watching the contractors shift uncomfortably under the weight of stares from all directions. Then, with a final glance toward Harrow, he stepped aside, leaving the post as it should have been all along, silent, dignified, and untouchable. It didn't take long for the palace liaison officers to arrive. 2 black saloon cars pulled up beyond the cordon, and from them stepped a pair of men in tailored overcoats, each wearing the understated lapel pin of the royal household. With them came 2 Ministry of Defence security officers in plain suits, their earpieces coiled neatly, their pace brisk and purposeful. Colonel Lennox met them halfway across the courtyard. Their conversation was low, measured, but the body language was easy to read. Lennox speaking in clipped points, the liaison officers listening intently, glancing past him toward Harrow and the 2 contractors. One liaison officer approached Harrow directly. He stopped just shy of the post, a sign of respect, and addressed him in a quiet voice. "Staff Sergeant, are you fit to continue?" "Yes, sir." "You may remain on post. This will be dealt with." The officer stepped back without another word, allowing Harrow to stand undisturbed. The contractors weren't given the same courtesy. The MOD security men flanked them, and the questioning began where everyone could see. It wasn't loud, but it was firm, each inquiry precise. "Who gave you the instruction? Do you have written authorization? Why did you bypass the chain of command?" The taller man tried to bluff, talking about international VIP protocols and urgent sweep directives. But when pressed for names and documents, he faltered. Mike, the quieter of the 2, kept his answers short, his eyes fixed on the ground. Within minutes the facts were clear. No such order had been issued. No risk assessment had been logged. The men had acted entirely on their own initiative, apparently hoping to clear the ceremonial post for a visiting dignitary's photo op, and they had assumed no one would challenge them. Colonel Lennox's voice carried just enough for the nearest spectators to hear. "Your accreditation is revoked as of this moment. You will leave the district under ministry escort. If you resist, I will have you arrested." The contractors' protests were met with the same measured tone. "You have interfered with a royal guard on duty. You will answer for it elsewhere." The MOD officers guided them toward the cordon. A few tourists began to applaud, hesitant at first, then steadier, not the whooping cheer of a spectacle, but the firm, rhythmic clap of people who had just witnessed a wrong set right. Harrow didn't look toward them. His stance remained perfect, but in the corner of his vision he saw Colonel Lennox glance back toward him once, just a fraction of a nod. It was enough. No words were needed between men who understood what it meant to hold the line. By late afternoon, the courtyard had thinned to just a trickle of passers-by. The contractors were long gone under MOD escort. The liaison cars had disappeared back toward the palace, and the rope line was once again just a quiet barrier between tourists and tradition. Staff Sergeant Harrow hadn't moved from his post except for the ceremonial half steps of rotation. The cold had deepened. A fine mist of condensation clung to the edges of his bare skin. The earlier commotion felt almost unreal now, as if it had happened in some other day, to some other man. Colonel Lennox reappeared from the archway, hands behind his back, his pace unhurried. He stopped a yard from Harrow, speaking in a voice low enough that it would carry no further than the gravel between them. "Your father would have handled that the same way," he said. Harrow didn't break stance, but his eyes flicked toward the colonel for half a second. "You knew him, sir?" Lennox nodded once. "Coldstream Guards. Same intake as me before he moved over. Solid man. Old guards don't let their own stand alone." There was a pause, filled with the faint clop of hooves from the stables and the muted rumble of traffic beyond Whitehall. Harrow's voice, when it came, was steady. "I knew you'd come, sir." "I didn't come for a scene," Lennox replied. "I came because you didn't flinch. You stood your ground without breaking a single rule. That's why we wear the red. To remind them it's not just cloth." For the first time since the morning, Harrow's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "Understood, sir." Lennox extended his hand, not a parade handshake, but the deliberate, firm clasp of soldiers who had seen enough to respect each other without ceremony. Harrow returned it briefly, before straightening back into position. As Lennox turned to leave, he gave a final glance over his shoulder. "Stay sharp, Staff. They'll remember today longer than you think." And then he was gone, boots fading into the echo of the archway, leaving Harrow once again in the cold, alone, but not unbacked. By the time the bugle sounded the evening relief, the winter light had already faded to that deep blue that comes just before night. The courtyard lamps flickered on, casting warm circles over the gravel as the next shift of guards marched in with the precision of a metronome. Staff Sergeant Harrow held his post until the exact moment of formal relief. Then, with a crisp ceremonial turn, he fell into step with the others, the cadence of boots echoing under the archway. There was no outward sign that anything unusual had happened that day, no slackness in formation, no deviation from protocol. But a few of the soldiers in the incoming detail gave him the smallest of nods as they passed, acknowledgements that needed no words. Beyond the rope line, small clusters of onlookers still lingered. They weren't the chattering, restless crowd of earlier. These people watched in near silence as the guards moved past, their expressions more reserved, more thoughtful. A man in a wool cap raised 2 fingers in a quiet salute as Harrow passed. A woman, arm linked with her daughter, murmured, "That's the one," as if sharing a secret. Inside the barracks, Harrow removed his bearskin and set it carefully on its stand, running one gloved hand along the edge in an unconscious gesture of respect. The familiar scent of wool, brass polish and boot leather filled the warm air. Around him, fellow guards went about the usual end-of-shift routines and unbuckling belts, easing shoulders, loosening boots, but more than one pair of eyes followed him with a faint, knowing respect. No one asked questions. No one needed to. In the world Harrow lived in, there was no higher recognition than a man's peers quietly acknowledging that he had done his duty and done it well. If you'd been standing in that courtyard today, would you have spoken up when you saw the guard in handcuffs, or stayed silent and trusted someone else to step in? And do you think the colonel was right to publicly confront the officers and contractors the way he did? Drop your answers in the comments. We read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's Royal Guard story. Share this video with someone who thinks these guards are just for show. It might change their mind. Our other stories are on your screen now. Click one and we'll see you tomorrow same time, with another moment that proves why these traditions still matter.